The word started moving through certain circles the way serious news always does, quietly at first, then all at once. Marlo Mike might be coming home, possibly by 2027. And the moment that information started spreading, the reaction it triggered had nothing to do with celebration or reunion. The question people were asking was simple and loaded. What does Boosie Badazz do now? If you know the history, you already understand why that question carries weight. We are talking about a man who sat at the center of one of the most explosive murder-for-hire cases this country has ever seen connected to a rap artist. A man whose name was tied to allegations serious enough to carry the possibility of the death penalty. And we are talking about a situation where the person prosecutors said pulled the trigger, the man they put on the stand, the man whose actions formed the entire foundation of the case, could potentially be walking back into the free world. You want to understand why Boosie is supposedly shook? Stay with us, because by the time we finish laying this out, you will understand exactly why the people who know the full story are walking on eggshells. Welcome back. And if you are new here, you landed in the right place at the right time. Because today we are going all the way in on one of the most dangerous and complicated stories to ever come out of the Southern rap scene. This is not a story about a social media beef. This is not about who said what on a podcast. This is a story about murder allegations, courtrooms, and what happens when the streets follow you all the way to the top of the music industry and threaten to take everything you built. Today we are breaking down the full truth behind Marlo Mike, behind Boosie Badazz, and behind the situation that people say has Boosie rattled in a way the public has never seen before. This one goes deep. So let's start where this story actually begins. Not with a courtroom, not with a verdict, but with a person. Because before Michael Louding became a name in legal documents, before he became a figure people debate on the internet, before he became the man at the center of one of the most talked about cases in Southern rap history, he was a young man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, navigating the same streets that produced Boosie Badazz himself. Michael Louding, known throughout those neighborhoods as Marlo Mike, grew up in the kind of environment where options felt narrow and danger felt constant. Baton Rouge in the mid-2000s was a city where poverty ran deep, where gang activity had established generational roots, and where the line between making it out and getting swallowed up was razor thin for young men coming up in certain parts of town. There was no industry waiting to absorb them, no network of opportunity pulling them towards safer paths. What there was the block, the people on the block, and the rules that govern life on that block. That was the world Marlo Mike came up in. He was not a rapper. He never sought the spotlight or wanted his name in any kind of public conversation. He was a street figure, someone who moved in the shadows of a world that was becoming very bright very fast because of one man whose star was rising out of that same environment. Torrance Hatch, the artist the world would come to know as Boosie Badazz. Here is where it gets real. Because the relationship between Boosie and Marlo Mike, as prosecutors laid it out in court, was not a friendship in any traditional sense. It was not two neighborhood guys running together and watching each other's backs the way you see in 1,000 rap videos. According to the prosecution's case, the relationship between these two men was transactional in the most violent way imaginable. Prosecutors alleged that Boosie, by this point one of the biggest names coming out of Baton Rouge, with a growing national profile and real money behind him, was paying Marlo Mike to handle situations that needed to be handled permanently. Let that land for a second. The allegation was not that Marlo Mike was just someone Boosie knew from the block. The allegation was that Marlo Mike was functioning as a paid hitman. That Boosie was allegedly the man with the money and the motive. And Marlo Mike was allegedly the man with the trigger. Prosecutors argued that across multiple incidents, this was the arrangement that existed between them. Not a partnership of equals, not a crew situation, not two friends who happened to be around when things went bad. A financial arrangement where one man allegedly gave the order and handed over the money, and another man allegedly went and made it happen. That is what prosecutors put in front of a Louisiana jury. And that is what made this case unlike almost anything the rap world had seen at that point in time. To understand why these allegations carried so much weight, you have to understand who Boosie was at this moment and what he represented to the people who followed his music and his career. By the late 2000s, Boosie Badazz was not just a regional name circulating through Louisiana and the surrounding states. He had built a catalog of music that was raw and deeply personal in a way that few artists in any era have managed to sustain across multiple projects. His mixtapes were circulating everywhere. His name was attached to real cultural momentum, the kind of following built not on radio play or marketing budgets, but on people genuinely connecting with what he was saying because it reflected lives they actually lived. His music was not the kind that kept the streets at a comfortable, profitable distance. It was the kind that documented the streets from the inside, with a level of detail and emotional honesty that only comes from someone who was not just observing, but living what he was rapping about. So when prosecutors started building a case alleging that his street involvement went far beyond what he was putting into lyrics, the collision between his public persona and those court documents sent a shock wave through the entire hip-hop world. People were not just reading about a man facing serious charges. They were reading about the man whose music had been the soundtrack to their lives, and sitting with the very complicated question of what it means when the line between the art and the life collapses completely. The specific case that became the centerpiece of the prosecution's theory involved the 2009 killing of a man named Terry Boyd. According to prosecutors, this was not a random act of street violence, not a situation that escalated out of a dispute and ended in tragedy. This was an alleged murder for hire, deliberate and calculated, that prosecutors argued Boosie had orchestrated from a position of power, and that Marlo Mike had gone out and carried out. This was the killing prosecutors used to build the first-degree murder charge against Boosie, a charge that carried with it the possibility of the death penalty in the state of Louisiana. Think about what that means. We are not talking about a weapons charge, a drug charge, or a manslaughter allegation. We are talking about the state of Louisiana looking Torrance Hatch in the eye and saying they were prepared to pursue execution. And Marlo Mike was the linchpin of the entire thing, because he was the person prosecutors alleged had physically committed the act that formed the foundation of the most serious charge Boosie would ever face in his life. The courtroom timeline stretched across years. Boosie was indicted. He sat in prison while his case moved through the system. And all the while, the music world watched and waited and argued. In comment sections, in barbershops, everywhere people talked about rap, trying to make sense of what was happening to one of the most compelling voices the South had produced. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the 2012 first-degree murder trial did not end the way prosecutors had planned. After hearing all of the evidence, after sitting through the testimony and the arguments and the back and forth of a high-stakes criminal proceeding with the most severe consequences the legal system could impose, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict on the murder charge. Boosie walked out of that courtroom acquitted on the most serious count against him. That does not mean he walked out of that era without consequences. He had separate drug charges that kept him incarcerated until 2014. And the years he spent behind bars took a toll you can hear in the music he made during and after that period, and see in every interview he has done since coming home. But the murder charge, the one that had the whole culture holding its breath, the one that could have taken him away forever, ended in an acquittal. That is the documented legal outcome. And no amount of internet commentary changes what that jury decided after hearing what was presented in that courtroom. Marlo Mike's story, however, ended very differently. While Boosie's jury returned a not guilty verdict, Michael Louding faced his own reckoning in those same courts. And when that reckoning came, it came hard. He was convicted in connection with the killing of Terry Boyd. And the sentence handed down was life without the possibility of parole. Not a 10-year bid, not a 20-year stretch with the chance of early release. Life without parole. In Louisiana, that means exactly what it sounds like. You go to prison, and the state does not intend for you to ever come back out. No projected release date. No parole board to petition after a certain number of years. The door closes, and it is designed to stay closed. That verdict and that sentence became part of the permanent legal record of what happened during that chapter of Baton Rouge's history. And for a while, for a few years at least, it seemed like that was going to be the end of the public conversation around this story. Marlo Mike was inside with a life sentence. The case was closed. The verdicts were in on both sides of it. Boosie was out by 2014, rebuilding his life and his career. And the story started to feel like history rather than something still unfolding. But history has a way of refusing to stay in the past when the right person decides to pick it back up and bring it into the present. And the person who did exactly that The person who took a story many people had filed away as settled and made enough noise about it to pull a whole new generation into the conversation was a man out of Fort Worth, Texas named Charleston White. If you know Charleston White, you already know he operates at a volume most people are not prepared for. He is not a rapper, not a journalist, not a lawyer, not an academic. What he is someone who built one of the most unusual and polarizing platforms in internet culture by being willing to say, out loud and on camera, things that most people either keep private or frame very carefully before sharing publicly. He has talked openly about his own past, his criminal history, the time he spent incarcerated as a young man, and the way those experiences shaped his perspective on street culture, the rap industry, and the relationship between the two. That personal history is central to how he presents himself and why a segment of the audience takes what he says seriously. He is not coming at these topics from a distance. He is coming at them as someone who says he has lived inside the same world he is now critiquing from the outside. Charleston White has gone at Boosie publicly and repeatedly over the years, and his commentary has not been subtle or measured or designed to leave room for interpretation. He has challenged Boosie's street credibility directly, questioned the narrative around what happened during those cases in specific terms, and made arguments that the public conversation around Boosie's acquittal does not capture the full picture of what he believes went down during those years in Baton Rouge. Whether his beliefs are accurate, whether they are based on information that goes beyond the public record, or whether they are the conclusions of someone processing old stories through a very specific personal lens. Those are questions without clean answers. What is not a question is that his commentary generated reaction every single time it dropped. Boosie responded publicly on multiple occasions. Fans took sides. Clips got shared across every platform. And with every round of that cycle, the story got another injection of energy that kept it moving through the algorithm and into conversations that had nothing to do with the original 2009 events. But here is the specific angle that has people talking right now. The part that goes beyond the general back and forth between these two figures and touches directly on why Marlo Mike's name is suddenly back at the center of the conversation. Charleston White has been vocal about Marlo Mike specifically, and what he has been saying is not just about relitigating the past. What he has been pushing publicly is the idea of fighting for Marlo Mike's freedom. He has made statements about wanting to see Marlo Mike come home. He has raised the question of whether the conviction was just and whether anything can or should be done about it. He has positioned himself as someone who is not willing to accept that a life sentence handed down years ago is necessarily the final word on what happens to Michael Louding. And when you sit with what that actually means, when you think through the implications of a loud and visible public figure with a significant audience taking up that specific cause, you start to understand immediately why this development would land with such force among people connected to those original events. Think about what it would mean if that campaign ever gained real traction. Think about what it would mean if Marlo Mike's case were ever revisited in a serious legal context. If an appeal found purchased somewhere in the Louisiana court system. If some argument that had not been made before found the right judge at the right moment. If the sentence that was supposed to be the permanent end of the story turned out not to be permanent after all. A man walking out of prison after serving a life sentence is not just a man going home. He is a man with a complete and detailed account of everything he experienced, everything he allegedly did, and everything he allegedly was instructed to do, and by whom. He is a man who, if he chose to tell that story publicly, could do so in a media environment that would make sure every word reached every corner of the internet within hours. Podcasts, live streams, documentaries, tell-all interviews. The infrastructure for that kind of revelation exists at a scale it never did when these events first occurred. And that reality, the reality of what a freed Marlo Mike could potentially say in a world full of cameras and platforms and audiences hungry for exactly this kind of story, is the thing that changes the entire emotional weight of this situation for anyone whose name might come up in that telling. That is the dynamic underneath the panic narrative. Not a physical confrontation, not a street beef playing out in the present. The stakes being discussed in those comment sections, the stakes that have people saying Boosie is shook, are informational stakes. The stakes of a man who knows things, who allegedly did things, and who allegedly knew who ordered them, potentially walking into a world where telling that story would be the most valuable thing he could offer, and where platforms would line up to give him the space to tell it. That is a different kind of threat than anything the streets send your way, because there is no way to prepare for it in advance and no way to control the outcome once it starts moving. For Boosie, the years since his 2014 release have been a complex and very public journey, playing out across interviews, social media, music releases, and a string of controversies that have kept him in conversations well beyond his legal history. He came home to a fan base that had genuinely held him down while he was inside. He released music. He rebuilt his profile. He became one of the most interviewed and most argued about figures in Southern hip-hop, not just because of his past, but because of who he continues to be publicly. Candid, unfiltered, willing to say things that generate strong reactions from people on every side of any given conversation. That version of Boosie, the post-incarceration public figure who seems almost allergic to staying quiet, is the version most of his current audience knows best. But the shadow of the 2009 to 2012 period never fully disappears, no matter how many new conversations get started on top of it. That shadow is structural. It is part of the foundation of his public biography in a way that nothing he does going forward can fully displace. Charleston White understood that when he chose Marlo Mike as a focal point, because attaching the Marlo Mike narrative to a public campaign, even one whose legal prospects are unclear, even one that may never produce actual courtroom results, guaranteed that Boosie's name would stay locked to the most sensitive chapter of his past in the minds of every new audience that discovered the story. Every video about freeing Marlo Mike is also, inescapably, a video that reminds people of everything that was alleged about Boosie during those years. Every discussion of the conviction is also a discussion of the acquittal and of what the prosecution argued about who gave the alleged orders. The two stories cannot be separated because the prosecution linked them in a courtroom, and Charleston White has made sure that link stays visible in the public conversation years after those proceedings ended. What this story ultimately reflects, when you zoom all the way out, is something bigger than any one person's biography or any one case's legal outcome. It reflects the way street life and the music industry created a set of conditions in places like Baton Rouge during the mid-2000s where the distance between making it and losing everything was almost non-existent. It reflects the way legal systems handle cases that sit at the intersection of race, poverty, celebrity, and violence, and the ways those outcomes satisfy some people's sense of justice while leaving others unconvinced. And it reflects the way internet culture has transformed the relationship between documented history and current drama, collapsing the distance between something that happened 15 years ago and something that feels like it is happening right now. One person with a platform and a cause can keep a story alive indefinitely if they are willing to keep feeding it new energy, new angles, and new reasons for fresh audiences to care. And while we are here, let's talk about something that rarely gets enough attention in these conversations: the broader Baton Rouge music scene and what it actually looked like to be coming up inside it during the same years these events were allegedly unfolding. Because understanding that environment is not just background color. It is essential context for understanding how a situation like the one prosecutors describe could even develop in the first place. Baton Rouge in the 2000s was producing music at a rate and a quality level that deserved far more national attention than it was receiving at the time. The city had its own distinct sound, its own energy, and its own set of artists who were building real audiences without the kind of major label infrastructure that New York and Atlanta and Los Angeles took for granted. Boosie was the most visible of that generation, but he was not operating in isolation. He was part of a community, a scene, a network of people all navigating the same realities at the same time, trying to build something with music while staying alive in an environment that was genuinely dangerous for young black men in ways that went far beyond anything that could be packaged neatly into a press release or a radio interview. The challenge that artists in that position have always faced is that the authenticity that makes the music connect is inseparable from the reality the music documents. You cannot be the most honest voice about what is happening in a place without being inside what is happening in that place. And being inside, it means the lines between observer and participant, between documenting the streets and being embedded in them, are not always clear or easily maintained. Boosie navigated that tension for years, and his music reflects both sides of it: the beauty and the cost, the loyalty and the consequences, the love and the violence. woven together in ways that made it impossible to separate the art from the life. When the legal system came for him, it came for exactly that inseparability. For Marlo Mike, that same period landed in a completely different way. Because while Boosie walked out of the courtroom cleared of the most serious charge, Marlo Mike went into his own proceedings carrying the full weight of the conviction that followed. His life sentence was not handed down in the abstract. It was handed down in the specific context of what prosecutors established about his role in Terry Boyd's death. And whatever someone thinks about the fairness of that outcome, whatever arguments could be made about the justice system and its relationship to young black men from environments like the one Marlo Mike came from, the legal reality is that he has been inside a Louisiana prison ever since. That is the reality Charleston White has been publicly pushing against. And that is the reality that would have to change at the legal level for any of the dramatic online speculation about what happens when Marlo Mike comes home to move from internet narrative into something with actual stakes in the physical world. So what do you think about where this situation is actually heading? With Charleston White making noise about getting Marlo Mike home, and the internet keeping this whole story alive for a brand new audience every few months. Do you think we are ever going to see a real legal development that changes the equation here? And if Marlo Mike ever did walk out of that prison, what do you think the fallout would actually look like for everybody whose name is connected to this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I know you have opinions on this one. And if you want to stay up on the stories that matter and the breakdowns that go deeper than any headline ever will, hit that subscribe button, because we have more content waiting that goes exactly where this one just went.